Look, okay, second place is still good, Second place. What a massive achievement. Way ahead of schedule, youngest squad in the league. Hey, look, we didn't win it this year, but we're on the right track. Second place, just as good as first place, if you ask me. Well, no, not quite as good as first place, but second still good. Yep. Um, didn't want to win it this year anyway. We're fine with second. It wasn't all that long ago that following a run of only one win in 9 matches, Unai Emery was sacked as Arsenal manager following a 2-1 defeat at home to Eintracht Frankfurt in the Europa League. After 6 games in charge for Freddie Ljungberg, Mikel Arteta was appointed as Arsenal manager with the club at an extremely low point in their history. 22 years of Arsene Wenger had finished, and Unai Emery, a manager who boasted unbelievable success in Europe with Sevilla and excellent domestic results in France with PSG, had been chosen as the man to lead Arsenal into the post-Wenger world. And just 18 months later, he was cast aside, an appointment gone wrong. Given the season Arsenal have just had under Mikel Arteta, it may be easy to assume that the writing was on the wall the entire time. Arsenal weren't very good as Unai Emery wasn't very good, and after they got rid of him and got in Mikel, it's been plain sailing up until the current day, where Arsenal are seemingly back to the big time, back in the Champions League, and back to seriously competing for future Premier League titles. A football season is a deceptively long and grueling affair. You can watch your club go from flying high to a club in crisis and back around all over again over the course of mere weeks, let alone months. Results across seasons start to merge together. Narratives are drawn, reinforced, regurgitated, and forgotten as quickly as they once appeared. Players start the season as finished has-beens who the fan base are desperate to ship out before the summer window shuts, only for the same players to find some form and become seemingly world beaters before the year's end. Managers are simultaneously the right man for the club when they're on a decent run of form with some good results, and they're not fit to be anywhere near your club as soon as a few results start not going their way. Results get blurred together, performances are forgotten about and misremembered. You find yourself stumbling across a result or an old clip of a game on Twitter and asking yourself, Christ, was that this season? I swear that was 2 seasons ago now. A football season is long. Too long and too full of drama, story, tension and fan unrest for an overwhelming amount of football clubs to bear. Decisions are made on feeling and with fear, and logic can be foregone, all for the temptation of a quick fix and a reset once the season ends, with renewed promises that something like this would never be allowed to happen again until it inevitably does. However, Arsenal's 2022-23 season has acted as the culmination of years of work in bucking this trend, a brilliant antithesis to this line of thinking and a pure testament towards trusting the process. Mikel Arteta took charge of Arsenal on December 20th, 2020, with the club sat in 8th place, and in a situation totally unfamiliar for the club, coming off the back of Arsene Wenger's 22-year reign. With a squad that had just reached the Europa League final and finished in 5th with Emery in the season previous, there was an expectation here that things couldn't really get worse than 8th, and a new manager bounce and fresh ideas from Arteta would at least see Arsenal finish in some European qualifying place. Arsenal under Arteta got no better. Mikel Arteta's reign started with a 1-1 draw to Bournemouth, followed by a 2-1 defeat at home to Chelsea. A 2-0 win over Manchester United showed signs of promise before Mikel Arteta's Arsenal went on to draw 4 consecutive league games to Palace, Sheffield United, Chelsea and Burnley. Arsenal's January signings saw a loan deal for Southampton's out-of-favour fullback Cedric Soares and another loan deal for centre-back Pablo Mari, which cost a reported £8 million loan fee. Arteta's first season with Arsenal wasn't all bad, but was peppered by some terrible results, including getting thumped by Man City, beaten by Brighton and losing to Aston Villa and Spurs. Arteta also oversaw Arsenal's capitulation in the Europa League, throwing away a 1-0 away lead from the first leg to draw 2-2 on aggregate in the second and be knocked out on away goals to Olympiacos. Arteta winning the FA Cup with Arsenal in this same season cannot be understated and almost certainly went a long way in saving his job in future seasons to come. Arteta's first season at Arsenal saw his side finish in 8th place in the Premier League, their worst finish since 1995. But okay, this might have been somewhat expected. Arsenal were going through a period of transition. Unai Emery had been sacked midway through the season and Arteta had to pick up the pieces. With all of that out of the way, Arteta now had a chance to mould the team into one of his own. He had money to spend in the summer transfer window, a full summer pre-season to himself, and the team was now fully under his control for the remainder of the football year. Surely, Arsenal were good enough to finish higher than 8th place again. Arsenal began the 2021 season by shaking things up behind the scenes. Head of football Raul Sanelli departed, with technical director Edu and Mikel Arteta himself now heading up the football recruitment direction. The two men started their new roles by immediately making mistakes. Arsenal's first major transfer through the door was former Chelsea winger Willian on a perplexing 3-year contract. The arrival of the 32-year-old seemed at odds with the rebuild needed following the previous season. A disaster of a signing which, outside of the opening game away at Fulham, never reached the quality needed for Arsenal. Cedric Soares and Pablo Mari were signed to permanent deals with a similarly disappointing output across the season. Arteta fell out with key figures of the squad. Guendouzi was shipped out on loan to Hertha and 300k a week Mesut Ozil was relegated to the reserves and left alone to stream Fortnite. The club would offer striker Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang a 3-year contract on a reported 250k per week. And just a little over a year later, Aubameyang would be stripped of the captaincy and ostracised by the club. Arteta struggled to find any sense of rhythm or form with Arsenal, sometimes playing a back 3 with wing-backs and sometimes playing with a back 4 and 3 in midfield. Bukayo Saka was deployed at left-back, right midfield, left wing, right wing and everywhere else in between. Arteta favoured the massively out-of-form Willian over every other wing option at the club, and new permanent signing Cedric Soares became so unfavourable to Arteta that Granit Xhaka was forced to fill in at fullback in Arsenal's Europa League semi-final against Unai Emery's Villarreal. A torrid 0-0 draw at home followed a turgid 2-1 away defeat, which saw Arsenal embarrassingly knocked out of Europe by a team managed by the very man replaced by Arteta. As of Boxing Day 2020, Arsenal found themselves in 15th place in the Premier League, and #ArtetaOut was in full swing and at its zeitgeist. Arteta's first full season in charge had gone just about as badly as it possibly could have, and the odds of Serie A winner Massimiliano Allegri becoming the new Arsenal head coach were shortening quickly. Arsenal under Arteta in the 2021 season finished in 8th place yet again, an absolutely torrid season which saw Arsenal fail to qualify for any European competition for the first time since 1994. Not only that, Arsenal finished the season trophyless, getting dumped out of the FA Cup early to Southampton, dumped out of the League Cup to Manchester City, and dumped out of the Europa League to the aforementioned Villarreal in the semi-final. Arsenal Football Club, a club synonymous with winning trophies and qualifying for Europe's biggest stage, had just finished 8th twice in consecutive seasons. Fan unrest was rampant and Arsenal Football Club was a club in crisis. Arsenal had just sacked an experienced and proven head coach in Unai Emery and appointed an ex-Arsenal player who had never even managed a club before. The writing was on the wall and everyone expected Arteta's departure, possibly due to the lack of fans in stadium due to the COVID-19 pandemic, possibly due to the costs involved, or possibly just due to some calm thinking and level heads. The people in charge of Arsenal did the most surprising thing imaginable, and they kept the faith. A rarity in modern football, the board decided to back the man they claimed they would back. An FA Cup win in his first year and some very brief and individual but promising performances across the season, including a 3-1 away win at Chelsea, which saw Arteta deploy a front three of Saka, Smith Rowe and Martinelli for the very first time, was just enough for the board to keep the faith. The decision would be the catalyst that would foster Arsenal's best season for almost 20 years. Arteta's Arsenal was starting to take shape. Martin Odegaard had been signed on a permanent deal in the preceding winter transfer window, and Arteta entered his second pre-season and his third season in charge of the Gunners with clearer ideas of how to shape the team. Arrivals included Ben White, Aaron Ramsdale, Lokonga and Tomiyasu. Arteta stripped the club of anyone who wasn't on board with his vision of football. Torreira, Maitland-Niles, Bellerin, Kolasinac, David Luiz, Willian, Aubameyang, Guendouzi all left the club and Ozil's contract was left to run its course. Technical director Edu had no qualms about exactly what this was and in an interview at the time referred to this as cleaning the squad. Even still, simply cutting this many important and influential players at the club meant that Arteta's third season in charge of the Gunners still wasn't all plain sailing. Arsenal started the 21-22 season with 3 consecutive defeats to Brentford, Chelsea and Manchester City without scoring a single goal. Following this tricky opening period, Arsenal would go 8 games undefeated before losing to Liverpool. By December, the squad had taken shape in Arteta's image, with the 3 at the back system ditched and familiar faces in Saka, White, Smith Rowe, Partey, Martinelli and Gabriel becoming mainstays in the first choice 11. Arsenal stumbled at the final hurdle, dropping out of the top 4 to rival Spurs just weeks before the end of the season, but a 5th place finish put the team back into the Europa League and set them up for their best season in recent memory. By now, the Arteta out brigade had almost entirely been dismissed, and Arteta had a clear pathway for the team. The intelligent recruitment that had been slowly improving for a few seasons by this stage continued. Gabriel Jesus, Fabio Vieira and Zinchenko were brought in on reasonable fees and reasonable wages, and this was supplemented with Leandro Trossard and Jorginho in the January transfer window. Despite not winning the league, Arsenal finished the season with their highest points tally since 03-04, which was when they were last crowned champions. Arsenal have the youngest squad in the league. They have a clear identity and way of playing. Apart from Pepe, they have practically no players who are wasting away on massive contracts or banished to the reserves in their twilight years, and they look on course to compete for many, many years to come. This feels like just the start for Arsenal and Arteta. And with that long history lesson completed, it's time to ask the question, why hasn't this really happened at any of the other Big Five clubs who are chasing Manchester City for supremacy? It's no coincidence that I'm making this video directly after making a video about Chelsea's decision to sack Graham Potter, and that's because the restraint and self-control Arsenal have shown in the way they have run their club over the past few seasons just feels like an incredibly rare thing when assessing top clubs across elite football. United have bounded around different managers with different playstyles for years and years upon Ferguson's retirement and still haven't really figured it out. Spurs went from Pochettino to Mourinho to Nuno Espirito to Conte in what must be some of the most whiplash-inducing managerial appointments in recent memory. Chelsea sacked Champions League winner Thomas Tuchel just to hire and then fire Potter after 7 months. Only Liverpool have shown leniency with Klopp through the bad times, and I don't think it's any surprise that they're the only club to really have been able to compete with Manchester City during the Qatar Pep Guardiola era. Because that's what it seriously takes to compete with them. Manchester City have arguably the best manager in the world with arguably unlimited resources to supplement him with. If there was a time period in Premier League history where simply throwing enough money at your club would get you a Premier League title, then those days are now long gone. Modern Manchester City in the year 2023 are so outstanding that it's almost unbelievable. The only way anyone is going to be able to compete with them will be through years of squad building and careful planning and consideration. Liverpool have proven it with Klopp, giving him 4 full years of backing, culminating in their Premier League title in the 1920 season. And yes, although Arsenal haven't quite managed to win the Premier League this season, Arsenal have proven it with their backing of Mikel Arteta. I just feel like nothing Liverpool and Arsenal have done simply couldn't have also been done by any other big club in the Premier League or even abroad. I mean, Bayern Munich have left themselves in a mess by sacking Nagelsmann at the first sign of a results downturn, and PSG haven't improved their chances of a Champions League trophy despite sacking a manager and hiring a new one every other season. Arsenal have spent money, of course, hundreds of millions of pounds, but have they really signed anyone under the Mikel Arteta era that other top clubs around Europe simply couldn't have? Jesus and Zinchenko were castaways from City that went for reasonable fees. Players like Odegaard, Tomiyasu and Tierney were widely available at low fees as well. I mean, Aaron Ramsdale, Gabriel Martinelli, these aren't big names on big fees. These weren't players exploding in the Premier League that Arsenal, and only Arsenal, could capitalise on. Arsenal's transfer business has just been extremely savvy, and there's been a real thought throughout regarding wage structure, squad size and squad age. Arsenal have totally avoided the pitfalls that the other big clubs have found themselves in, paying extortionate wages for talent coming off of their best and most prolific seasons, only to find themselves not quite able to replicate the form to justify the cost. Arsenal signed young players that were slipping under the radar at the other big clubs in Europe. Almost every transfer since Arsenal have been burned by the signing of Nicolas Pepe has felt like there's been a real, focused and aligned plan to squeeze the most amount of quality out of every penny. Players like Gabriel, Martinelli, Aaron Ramsdale, and even to an extent someone like Ben White were all well scouted, assessed and picked up before they hit full force and turned into elite level Premier League players. Look, I'm not trying to say that all of these players were unknown wonder kids from the depths of Colombia or something that only Arsenal knew about and no one else could have. As already mentioned, Arsenal have spent hundreds of millions of pounds building this team, but it's safe to say that none of these players were simply unobtainable by other clubs. Other clubs simply didn't see the value in these players that Arteta and Edu and the whole Arsenal backroom staff saw in them. Ben White was great at Brighton, but who knew just how good he would become for Arsenal, and at right back no less. Aaron Ramsdale was relegated with Sheffield United. Who was interested in him then? Gabriel Martinelli. I mean, how many top clubs had even really heard of Gabriel Martinelli, let alone were willing to take a risk on him? Arsenal struck the deals on these players right before the iron got hot and not afterwards. Jadon Sancho was utterly fantastic for Borussia Dortmund, so much so that Man United had to pay £80 million for him. If they had scouted him analysed him and courted him early, they might have been able to get him for around the £20 million mark from the City Academy, just like Dortmund did. It might have gone a long way in taking the pressure off of some of his performances. I think we also need to look at the work done with many members of the squad who were already with the club when Arteta took the reins. Who on earth could have seen the rise of someone like Bukayo Saka? Massive credit needs to be given to Unai Emery, who brought him into the first team squad, but he was almost exclusively deployed under him as a left back or a left wing back in a back five. Only really under Arteta has Saka found himself playing further and further up the pitch, as Arteta showed a willingness, even in the awful times where the club was finishing in 8th place, to trust a Hale-End youngster with being the main attacking threat for a prestigious club with European ambitions. How many other clubs in this situation would simply have just caved to the pressure and panic bought a senior winger to try and get themselves out of mid-table? But this even extends beyond just the youth. Granit Xhaka, whose relationship with the fan base by the end of the Emery reign was so toxic and abusive that both sides were literally telling each other to fuck off on the pitch, seemed destined to leave the club upon Arteta's arrival and join Roma. Arteta saw something in Xhaka, a player not explicitly young, trendy or highly rated, that no one else saw. Arteta convinced him to stay, eventually worked him into the left side of his three-man midfield, and the rest is history. Granit Xhaka, the same Granit Xhaka that threw the captaincy armband to the ground upon being substituted in 2019, is now beloved by the fans for his performances and was one of the best midfielders in the league this season. Just how many players in the club you support are in a similar situation to Granit Xhaka was at Arsenal in 2019? Will they be re-evaluated, reassessed and reintegrated? Or will they be simply cast away, sold off to the highest bidder and replaced by someone else in the hope they are an improvement? Ultimately, I think this is my point. Arsenal Football Club, through a variety of reasons, have taken an extremely brave approach to building a team that is ready to compete with the very best. Granted, some of this may simply be down to circumstance. I'm not exactly sure if Arteta keeps his job up until now without that first FA Cup win and without the furious fan base not being allowed at the Emirates for several periods over the COVID-19 pandemic. But nonetheless, they've done it all the same. They picked Arteta, they backed him, they allowed the club to properly reset and properly realign. Arsenal mostly held their hands up and just accepted being quite awful for several seasons. They dropped out of European competition. They finished 8th twice. They lost out on the Champions League to bitter rivals Spurs at the death. And they remained unwavered. They simply believed hard enough in the project, and every decision made in terms of tactics, systems, transfers and the dressing room was totally in sync with all of it. Importantly, they also allowed Arteta time to make mistakes and improve as a coach. In a way, I actually feel quite sorry for Unai Emery, who wasn't afforded the same level of level-headed thinking. Before Arsenal and after Arsenal, Emery has proven he's a top-class coach with a history of improving teams, and I honestly believe that he would have done the same for Arsenal if he was given the time. It would be erroneous of me to praise the Arsenal board for backing the current manager and giving him time without pointing out that they failed to do so for the man before him. But regardless, Arteta is a rare case of a manager simply being allowed to learn on the job. He put a lot of faith in Willian to be a senior figure at the club, and it was a total disaster. He tinkered with systems and formations. He made odd decisions. Xhaka popped up at right back. Cedric signed permanently. Aubameyang was given a 3-year deal and the captaincy. But the club stuck with him and believed in the project and have bore the fruits of it all. Here we can see a 10-game rolling XG plot for Arsenal from the end of the Unai Emery period until the present day. The yellow sections are where expected goals against were higher than expected goals for, and the purple is vice versa. Everyone knows Arsenal are class now. The big purple patch on the far right of this graph is no surprise to anyone. But what I want to highlight here are the big patches of yellow throughout Arteta's reign. In these moments, this is when your project and your values are tested. These are the periods when managers are sacked, players are panic bought, and projects are abandoned. If Arsenal had sacked Arteta in this moment, they never would have seen the club explode into this one. Many clubs, big and small, talk a lot about backing a manager, giving him what he needs, creating a culture and cultivating club values. But often at the first sign of the ship beginning to veer off course, they throw the whole thing overboard. It's really easy to talk about believing in the project when you're winning football matches. The real test is when you stop. Many clubs fail at this first hurdle. This often leads clubs to turning into unworkable mismatches between squad and style, between personnel and managerial profile. Just this season alone, I can think of a club like Leeds United, who for some reason have tasked Sam Allardyce in keeping them up, despite practically the entire squad being energetic, high-pressing, Red Bull-style football players that Allardyce wants nothing to do with. Southampton had a similar squad of young, energetic players, adept at pressing high and covering distance across the pitch. When Hassan Hutel was sacked for Nathan Jones, the squad couldn't have been further from exactly the kind of player Jones needs for his system. Jones, specialising in direct football, long passes and getting crosses into the box, found himself unable to implement his system with the only two centre forwards at the club both being under 5'10". Of course, Southampton did eventually sign Jones a target man in Paul Onuachu, and 12 days later they just sacked Jones anyway. Chelsea have spent more money than Arsenal have since the beginning of the Ted Boehly era, and what do they have to show for it? A totally unbalanced squad and an over-bloated dressing room. A team featuring players like Aubameyang, specifically brought in for Tuchel and only played under him for 59 minutes before they sacked him. No fullback cover for the consistently injured James and Chilwell, no actual strikers, and just loads of young wingers and wide forwards. Chelsea is an extreme example of my point earlier regarding finances in terms of squad building in modern football. It's not enough to simply go out and spend money on good players. These players have to be considered in their suitability for the club, the number of players you already have in your squad, the system you're going to play them in, and the manager they're going to play under. Arsenal mostly got all of these right, and even when they got it wrong, their recruitment philosophy prevents any one failed signing from hurting the club too badly. Lokonga was signed from Anderlecht in the summer of 2021, and it hasn't really worked out for him at this time. The difference is that Lokonga is 23 years old and only cost the club £16 million in the first place. Arsenal's transfer strategy in signing young and undervalued players dampens any potential risk and maximises any return on investment if the transfer doesn't work out. Maybe my temperament and praise for Arsenal should be cooled slightly. Indeed, Arsenal have not won the Premier League title in the 22-23 season. They've actually not won anything. There will be hordes of people that will dismiss all of the work done at Arsenal for that fact alone. But as I've tried to explain throughout this video, the achievement in this process will set Arsenal up to truly compete in the future. Arsenal feel like a club synergised, a club totally in sync. Arsenal have a reasonable squad size, reasonable depth all over the pitch, a reasonable wage bill, the youngest team in the Premier League, and have a style, a game plan and a philosophy to take into the future. They simply don't find themselves in a position where they need to have a fire sale before June 30th so they don't get sanctioned by financial fair play like Chelsea do. They aren't in a situation where they've flip-flopped between managers so frequently that they're struggling to find someone anyone that they deem worthy enough to actually take the job like Spurs currently do. And they haven't signed underperforming players on gargantuan wages like Manchester United have. It might sound like nothing impressive to just be a well-run club, but so many of the big boys seemingly fail to even reach this relatively low bar of organisation, planning or structure. Arsenal aren't the finished article by any means. Arsenal aren't the greatest team in the world. They still have to deal with some hangovers from the pre- and early Mikel Arteta era. Pepe has a year left on his contract, Tavares has 2, Lokonga has 3. They will need to move on ageing veterans like Xhaka, and they'll need to reinforce their right wing unless they want to run Saka to the ground by the time he's 25 years old. But these are all minor issues in the grand scheme of things. The squad and the manager are settled. Now they have those steady foundations and the influx of Champions League money once again, the club is in a perfect position to kick on and evolve. In football, there will always be unforeseen stumbling blocks. Arsenal haven't won the Premier League title, and due to the sheer dominance of Manchester City, there's of course no guarantee they will win it next season. But they've put themselves in the best position to do so when compared to any other club in the Premier League. And they've done so by behaving in a way that just feels so rare in football. To put it simply, and even reductively, Arsenal were willing to put both of their hands up and just be bad. They accepted for 2.5 seasons to just be bad. They finished 8th twice. They missed out on Champions League revenue 3 times. They played some terrible football. They suffered some horrific results. But when you actually believe in a project, when you actually trust a process, that's what you have to be willing to do. Arteta was their man. They backed him. They gave him the privilege to make mistakes, to grow and to learn. And Arsenal Football Club are so much better off for it. Wow, Brighton have just finished in 6th place in the Premier League. That means they'll be playing in Europe next season. What an achievement, and fair play to them. They've done so by careful squad planning, smart recruitment and scouting, and giving their managers time and patience to shape their club. I'm sure all the big clubs are looking at Brighton as there's some seriously important lessons to be learnt here. I'm sure they've all been influenced by the way Brighton run their club. Anyway, Liverpool need to sign 3 midfielders in one window because they waited ages for Bellingham, who was never going to come. Man United are trying to sign Neymar. Chelsea spent £300 million and have gotten worse. And Spurs have no director of football, and the managerial search is still going on after 70 days. So, maybe not.